You know what this is. You've seen it 1,000 times. That neat little grade of green, yellow, and red squares. The one that promises to make sense of all the chaos, to tame risk itself. It looks so clean, so simple, so decisive. But what if I told you it's more of an illusion than a tool? Okay, let's really get into this. This grid, the risk matrix, it's one of the most popular risk assessment tools on the planet. And to really get why it's so appealing and also why it's got some deep, deep problems, we're going to start by looking at how it's supposed to work in a field where the stakes, well, they just couldn't be higher. Aviation safety. All right, so first things first, let's unpack the appeal. How is this thing actually supposed to work? The whole idea is to take these messy, complicated, scary hazards and somehow funnel them into a simple, visual guide that helps us make really tough decisions. At its heart, it's all about figuring out what they call safety risk. The International Civil Aviation Organization, that's the ICAO, they define it as a mix of two really basic questions. First, how likely is it that something bad will happen? And second, just how bad will it be if it does? This all leads to what looks like a super straightforward 3-step process. Step 1, you figure out the probability. Step 2, you decide on the severity of the consequences. And step 3, you just plot those two things on the matrix to get your score. I mean, on the surface, it seems totally logical, right? To do that, you'd use tables just like these ones from the ICAO. So on one axis, you've got probability, and it runs all the way from extremely improbable up to frequent. And then on the other axis, you've got severity, and that could be anything from a tiny, negligible hassle to a full-blown catastrophic event where multiple people die. So once you have your two ratings, you find where they meet up on the matrix. And bam, that gives you your risk index, which lands you in one of 3 color-coded zones. Green means it's acceptable, you're good to go. Yellow is tolerable, which basically means, it's okay, but you might want to do something about it. And red is intolerable. That's the stop everything and fix this right now zone. It feels clear, it feels logical, it feels actionable. So it sounds like the perfect tool, doesn't it? It takes these big, messy problems and boils them down into a simple, color-coded answer. It gives us this wonderful sense of control. But as we're about to find out, that feeling might be dangerously misleaded. In fact, some researchers argue it does the exact opposite. David Ball and Lawrence Watt say it creates, and I'm quoting here, no more than an artificial and even untrustworthy picture. And let me tell you, that is not some fringe opinion. This is the beginning of a huge crack in the very foundation of this tool. And this brings us right to the heart of our explainer today, the cracks in the foundation. We're going to start peeling back the layers and really question the math and, well, the logic that's supposedly holding this whole thing up. You know, one of the biggest criticisms is that the risk matrix isn't really based on any kind of rigorous math. Researcher John Mosman points out that it actually started its life as something called a Likert preference system, which is basically a survey tool from psychology for gauging opinions and feelings. And somehow, this tool for measuring feelings, it just wandered into high-stakes fields like engineering, where precision is supposed to be everything. You can actually trace its weird journey through history. It pops up in the 1960s in chemical processing. Then its design gets tweaked based on methods for siting nuclear power plants. And by the 80s, it had gone completely mainstream, spreading everywhere. But here's the kicker. As it spread, a really critical piece of the puzzle just got lost. The original context and any data on whether it was actually reliable. Risk intelligence expert Chris Gibson just hits the nail on the head. He calls the matrix too insensitive, a blunt instrument that just doesn't have the nuance you need to get real insight into complex risks. So if it's such a blunt instrument, why does it feel so authoritative, so objective? Well, this brings us to the illusion of objectivity. Those pretty little colors can be so deceiving. See, the whole problem boils down to a battle between two different ways of thinking: qualitative judgments versus quantitative analysis. The risk metrics lives and breathes in the world of fuzzy concepts. Words like likely or moderate. They feel intuitive, sure, but they're totally subjective. Real quantitative analysis, on the other hand, that's all about the cold, hard numbers, data, and statistics. It's way harder, it can be controversial, and you actually have to defend your numbers. But it's also where the truth usually lives. And this reliance on fuzzy language leads to some massive flaws. Just think about it for a second. What does the word likely actually mean? To me, it might be a 50% chance. To you, it might mean 80%. Who knows? And that means two risks that both end up in the yellow box could have completely different real-world probabilities. The simple colors hide all that complexity, and that gives you a dangerously false sense of clarity. Which, of course, leads us to the biggest question of all. If this tool is so fundamentally flawed, so mathematically questionable, why is it everywhere? Why do so many of the world's biggest organizations rely on it for their most important decisions? Well, the answer has a lot less to do with math and a whole lot more to do with us. It's about our brains on risk and the incredibly powerful psychology that explains the Matrix's appeal. A psychologist named Howard Margolis gives us this fascinating way to think about it. He suggests that our brains don't really process risk in terms of statistics. Nope. Instead, we see everything through two very intuitive lenses. Danger, which is what it'll cost us if we accept a risk, and opportunity, which is what it'll cost us if we try to avoid it. And this just gets right to the heart of it all. Margolis argued that when we make big decisions, and I'm quoting again, it is the visceral feeling of risk, not a statistical calculation, that ultimately will be controlling. In other words, our gut feeling is driving the bus, not the spreadsheet. Margolis had this brilliant name for this tendency: binary bounded rationality. It just means we are hardwired to simplify things. We desperately want to see risk as an either-or proposition. Is this a real problem that I need to worry about, or is it basically nothing? We can't stand that messy gray middle ground. And there it is. That's the magic trick. The risk matrix, with its simple green, yellow, and red boxes, it perfectly mirrors our brain's deep desire for a clear, almost binary answer. It tells us this is safe, this is dangerous. It scratches that deep psychological itch for clarity, even if the answer it's giving us is just plain statistically wrong. So, if the risk matrix is basically a psychological comfort blanket and not a scientific instrument, what are we supposed to do? Well, we need to start thinking beyond the grid. We need to move towards a much smarter, more nuanced view of risk.
The path to real risk intelligence isn't about throwing the matrix in the trash. It's about understanding its limitations. First, you have to acknowledge it's a blunt instrument. So use it to start a conversation about risk, not to end one. The goal shouldn't be to defend why something is yellow instead of red. The goal should be to understand the entire system. And you have to always ask, what are these neat little colored boxes really telling us?
At the end of the day, a risk matrix gives us the feeling of control. It simplifies the complex. It reassures us. But this brings us to one last critical question we have to ask ourselves. What's truly more dangerous, the risk itself or the comforting, powerful illusion that we've already got it all under control?